Is your church board staying busy but not getting a lot done? We're talking about that today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ, we have had the honor of working with dozens and dozens and dozens of church boards over the years. Some of them great. Most of them have some dysfunctions, some bad habits that have crept into the way that they operate. And so I think there's some consistent dysfunctional habits that we see pop up a lot. 5 of them that we've identified today to talk about on the podcast, and maybe some solutions to some of these bad habits.
Yeah, habits sometimes are built in. They're baked into the recipe right from the start, maybe in the way a church oversight board is developed and organized originally. Sometimes, churches create such a board later in the life of the church and either do a good job establishing it or they don't. Or maybe, a church has had a council, a board, or whatever it might be for a long time, and it started off kind of healthy and functioning in a good capacity. But then, we could apply the word habits here over time, because people change out and just church changes, culture changes, all kinds of things change. And over time, they get to the point where maybe they're just not functioning at the level that they used to or would desire to now. So, really just like the church as a whole, that should be kind of monitoring itself and making necessary course corrections, so should the oversight boards of the church. And today's a great day for our church board, since we've looked at our board. So maybe these one or more of these 5 dysfunctions we're going to talk about will hit home.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess we've mentioned this when we've talked about other aspects of church boards in the past. We're using the term church board because it's the most generic term that we could use, but apply this to your deacons or your church council or your session or your consistory or your elders or whatever it is that you have, assuming you have some kind of governing body. Some churches don't. They just have their staff, and they've got their senior pastor, and then they're congregationally ruled otherwise. So if that's you, we actually would encourage you to think about building a board, because very often, I know actually this is ironic. We're talking about kind of the problems of church boards, and yet a church board that's functioning really well is an accelerant to the health of a church. So these dysfunctions are not reasons to get rid of a church board. They're just reasons to fix these problems. Because if you can get it right, it can really move the church forward in a positive direction. And the churches that don't have a church board, that it's just the senior pastor, or you have to rely so heavily on the congregation in order to make certain decisions, that's an even harder problem to overcome very often.
Yeah, we're certainly advocates of some type of oversight, high-level board of decision makers in the church, as opposed to more of a large congregationally driven authority structure in the church. So that's
right. So don't let these dysfunctions scare you away if you don't currently have something like this. Instead, listen to this and go, okay, let's not bake these mistakes into our church board when we build it. I would encourage you, this would be a great episode for you to listen to with your team, whatever that is, or send it to them and say, hey, watch this, and then let's talk about it. And just have some honest self-reflection and go, do we have any of these bad habits, or do we sometimes have some of these bad habits? It may not be an all or nothing proposition. It may be just something that happens some of the time. So With all that being said, then, AJ, by way of introduction, let's hop into these 5 dysfunctional habits that we see unhealthy church boards exhibiting.
Let's do it. The first one that we're talking about today is that the church board spends time on more trivial agenda items as opposed to more significant things. We're going to focus on the first half of what I just said. So many times we see boards that end up spending their time really, in more extreme cases, almost functioning as staff members, and really getting into the micromanagement and minutia of day-to-day church operations. And that, any of you that are on staff at the church know the myriad of things that could land on your plate, on your desk, any day of the week. And some of those are repetitive. That's just what you end up dealing with. That's what you're paid to deal with. And the church board ends up taking on a lot of those things. I don't know, Scott, do you think more so in smaller churches where there's smaller staff and the church board is like, well, this is just going to be our responsibility to do, and which we would still have an answer for that, or do you think it creeps up in other ways? But this first point is that the board is spending time on detail-oriented things that they shouldn't.
Yeah, I do think it probably is more common in smaller churches just because there's fewer hands to get all the work done. And so it's more likely that all of your church board members have hands in lots of other pots. So they're also a small group leader. They're also serving on the worship team. They're also serving in this ministry and that ministry. And which we would recommend against. We would say, find one very low responsibility area where you can serve in as a greeter or whatever. But anything that's a consistent teaching role, I'm not saying never lead a Sunday school class or a small group, but don't be on the hook for that every week, because that's going to take time away from doing elder like work or church board member type work. Helping with pastoral care and those kinds of things. So I think that it happens very often because they have their fingers in other pots. And so they bring that baggage with them, then that sort of myopic lens that they're applying then to the board. So they've got all the weight of whatever ministry they're a part of. And they think this creates we've talked about this on the podcast before, but almost creates a sense of a constituency. I've got to lobby for this ministry, or I have to lobby for this group of people and their particular needs, rather than looking at the whole. And so maybe a good barometer just to use. I know it's hard sometimes to go, well, what is minutia and what's important? What should we focus our time on? What should we not? There's we could talk about vision. We could talk about mission. Certainly those should be filters, but even just a really quick gut check of, does this impact at least 50% of the congregation? And if the answer is no, then it's probably not a detail we should get into. That's maybe not a hard and fast rule, but that's a good one to start with and go, does this impact at least half of the people here on a Sunday morning? And if the answer is no, then we probably should delegate this decision down to a different group.
Yeah. For those of you that are saying, okay, smarty pants, Mr. Know-it-all, Malphurs group guys, we just don't have enough people to get all this stuff done. We don't have that many volunteers. That is a topic for another day, and one that we've taken up several times. So certainly encourage you to search volunteer engagement on our website, or even just broadly out on the Google. And increasing volunteer engagement is many times the necessary antidote to the board spending time on trivial things.
Well, let's maybe, I don't want to get sidetracked here, but 3 really fast things. Number 1, yes, boost volunteerism, get more volunteers mobilized. 2, reduce the number of things that require volunteers. I mean, if you don't have enough volunteers, you may be running too many ministries for the size of churches you have. So scale back, simplify, and streamline, which we've talked about a lot on the podcast. And 3, recognize that it's not a light switch. Like if you've got church board members who are entangled in a bunch of things, you can't just immediately go, oh, well, they're not doing that anymore.
Mhm.
You're going to have to make a plan. They're going to have to replace themselves. And that could take 3, 6, 9 months to do. So it's okay. You can go, well, this isn't healthy or sustainable, but that doesn't mean you need to make a drastic change tomorrow. Start making a plan for how that could be different over the course of the next year, and then slowly roll that out and execute it. Just because you recognize a bad habit doesn't mean you'll be able to fix it overnight. It took you more than one day to build the bad habit. It's going to take you more than one day to disentangle yourself from it.
Great point. I think a lot of times church leaders feel very in a paralyzation of not changing, because it's not a light switch, as you said. If it's not a change that we can just make, developing a plan for change becomes too much work, too much effort, and instead they remain as is. So, yep, great point. All right, so that was spending too much time on trivial agenda items at the board level. The second one that we're talking about is that many times the board has unclear expectations for what they should be working on. This is a bit of the other side of the coin from what we just talked about. So the expectations should be clear for the board, and this might even get back into what has been officially, codified and delegated to a board by the congregation in your church. Could be outlined in the church constitution or bylaws. What exactly is the function of this board, council, whatever you call it, supposed to be? And we certainly advocate for higher level decision making amongst this level of leadership in the church, as opposed to, as we just said, these more trivial and minutia in detail oriented decisions that the board is making. So yeah, bring that up to the 30,000 foot level, have a better overview of the church, get up above the trees so we can see the forest, and concentrate on some real specific areas of ministry that the board has oversight and control over.
Yeah, I mean, very simple question. Do you have a job description, a position description for your board members? If you go, well, not really, there might be something in the bylaws, there might be something in the church constitution, as you said, AJ, but in terms of like a separate document that we would give to someone and go, here's what it means to be a church board member. It'd be good to have that. I commend you to look at Leading Leaders by Aubrey Malphurs. It's a book about church boards, and there's samples in the back of various policies, but also position descriptions and things like that. So I would recommend that you take a look at that. But it's important that people have clear expectations on what it is that they should be focusing on, what it is that they should be doing. And in the absence of that clarity, people will make up their own job description of what's important. And that's where they're going to spend their time. And so the reason why we are spending time on trivial things is because we're not clear on what we should be spending our time on. Yep. When let's point to Acts chapter 6, right? Why did the apostles appoint the deacons in the first place? It's because they realized, it's not good for us to be spending our time waiting tables. It's not because the job was beneath them. It's because it wasn't what their role was to be doing.
Yeah, a proper division of labor. Yeah,
that's right. And go, this isn't good. And so, hey, and listen, if the apostles can fall victim to spending time on things they shouldn't spend time on, certainly all of us are prone to make that same mistake. But they remedied that situation really quickly. And might I recommend you do the same? Kind of evaluate what should we be working on, and then create a position description or a job description that aligns with that. And when you're onboarding someone who's new to the team, make sure that they understand that in advance. Here's what the job is. Here's what the job isn't, so that someone doesn't think they're stepping into one thing when they're actually stepping into something else.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, it happens to us all the time. Over the weekend, Scott and I were texting back and forth about some website things for the Malphurs group. And I said, what can we outsource so that you are not spending your time on that? There's things that we have to say no to and that we need to try to delegate out. so that we can commit ourselves to the highest level function of whatever position we're in, to serve our ministries in the greatest capacity. All
Yeah,
righty.
that's right.
Our third one, our third dysfunction is that we may elevate low capacity strategic thinkers to this level of leadership in the church. And before you get all upset, because that kind of sounds super negative, everybody's different, right? People have been gifted in different ways. We have different personalities. We have different natural talents and abilities towards different things. And our church board should be looked at strategically. Of course, there is a high level of the spiritual side to this, for the Holy Spirit encouraging people into leadership, for others in leadership perceiving that about them through prayer. And of course, we have qualifications that we see in the New Testament for this level of leadership in the church. But we also need to think about the board's makeup and whether we have the right mix of personalities and of gifting. And this is not something that is static throughout the life of the church over decades and centuries as well. The church goes through different seasons of its ministry, and its leadership needs to be able to move with that to continue to guide and direct it well. And so, much like you could kind of look at the church plant scenario, in which we're very clear about this is a different season for this ministry. We need a different set of leaders for this than we will 5 years from now when we're an established church. So that becomes clear to people, but we kind of disassociate that type of thinking with an established church then. And it takes looking a little bit more into the details of where the church is in its life, to know what types of leaders should we have. Maybe some of the more standout examples of this would be we're planning a building project or a move, like significant change in the church, lots of resources and lots of planning. Maybe we want our board at that time to be strategic thinkers that have the capacity for those types of projects and shepherding a flock that could really, almost become harmed in that level of change in the church. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking all the time when we remove ourselves from these big decisions or big changes in the church back down into the more everyday things. We still need to be thinking about the makeup of our board so that we have a great mix of people.
Yeah, this is really important. That I think that a lot of my experience has been that a lot of churches elevate to the board people who are good guys. He's a good guy. He's been here a long time. There has a good track record in terms of character, and that is good. But we talk about this a lot in our leadership pipeline training, that character matters a lot, but it's not the only thing that matters. It's character and capacity. And it's a false choice to have to choose between the two. You don't have to say, oh, well, we can choose a good guy or we can choose someone who can get things done. No, you can be really choosy and say, we want to only elevate people who are really good guys and also who are really good at getting things done. And we often don't apply that standard to our board. And we make the case in our leadership pipeline processes that your highest capacity leaders really ought to be those board members, people who are really good at getting things done and really high in character. And so don't elevate people who can't lead their way out of a paper bag, who have no capacity to problem solve, who are like, oh, I don't know. And, to your point, AJ, they may not be hyper skilled in one particular area, about law or accounting or, but the leadership skills translate. And so the principles behind that, high capacity leaders have the ability to adapt to whatever the situation is because they tend to be quick learners or just really teachable. And they'll put in the work to figure out what they need to know. But those leadership skills tend to translate. So I would say don't elevate people who are low capacity in general, but especially as it relates to strategy and visioning. If they don't really have the ability to do that, then they may be a great person, a really high character person, and there may be great spots for them in leadership in your church, but probably not on your board. And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's okay. Not every person needs to be that. And I would just point scripturally to First Timothy 5. It says that the elders who direct the affairs of the church, which is all the elders. It's implied that all the elders are elders who rule or direct or manage the affairs of the church. That management function or capacity is a biblical qualification for eldership. And then it says those who they're worthy of double honor, the ones who are, especially the ones who are preaching and teaching. So it creates a bit of a distinction because, okay, the preaching and teaching, the ones who are doing the bulk of that are worthy of a double honor. But all of them ought to be people who can manage. And very often we think of it the opposite direction. Oh, we put the preaching and teaching and go, well, they all need to be able to do that. But it's all, if they can't really manage very well, that doesn't really matter. And the Bible kind of goes, no, they all need to be good at managing the affairs of the church, directing, ruling, leadership. And then you have some who carry more of the burden in terms of preaching and teaching. So
yeah, great distinction. Okay. Yeah, that's cool. Okay. Our next piece is that the board doesn't follow through well. The best made plans are all for naught if a plan of action and execution is never developed. And it can feel super energizing and just really unifying by having good discussions about the future and everybody being in agreement and saying, yeah, this is a good idea. We need to get this done. And then that be the end. That is a very common dysfunction among boards in churches. Any plans or ideas that are developed in meetings, one meeting, multiple meetings, have to turn into some level of project management going forward, developing milestones and applying due dates to things and breaking this down into pieces. Now, don't revert back to our number one point, spending time on trivial things, in which the board says, okay, we have to do all this. Much of following through involves delegation to the proper people to execute on pieces of a larger plan. But again, this is where, having people on the board that aren't able to think strategically or able to manage ideas and plans going forward can cut off the capacity of your board to function at a higher level. So developing a board that has the people that are able to do this, but then following through on the plans that are made is a game changer in the church. And it's one that ends up shortening your time to go live on great ideas and changes in ministry, instead of, seeing things drag out for months or even years.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I'll just say that the failure to follow through is maybe the biggest thing that we see, and it's a little bit baked into the cake. In that, I mentioned this before on the podcast, I think in other contexts, but it bears repeating, I think, here. Just think about the natural course of how a normal discussion happens. A board may pick up an agenda item one month, decide to discuss it, and not have all the information. I mean, people generally don't come to these meetings prepared. They didn't do any homework beforehand. So then they discuss it and then they go, oh, we'll pick it up next week or next month. So now there's a whole nother month until then they've forgotten all the things they talked about last time. And so they have to spend half the time just getting back up to where they were at the end of the last meeting. And then, and so this is how things can just drag from month to month. And then because they're constantly forgetting and having to relearn the things that they said they were going to do. So it's very important that if you're going to pick up an agenda item, you make a commitment to what is the next step? What are we committing to doing? Don't right. have any hanging chads in your meetings. Be really clear. We're going to make a decision on this at next month's meeting, or we're making a decision today, and here's who's responsible for executing. So just don't leave things hanging, lingering. No agenda hangovers. That just doesn't work. But that we see it a lot, and that's why things don't follow through. And then, because then you get 3-4 months, AJ, past it, and then you're like, why did we even bring that up in the first place? And why are we doing that? And you forgot why you even brought it up, and then you didn't. Then you don't do it, and then you tell us when you work with us, well, we thought about doing that a year and a half ago. Well, whatever happened with that? Well, it just didn't work out. Well, did it not work out, or did you not follow through? Because those are two different things. Very often they'll go, this didn't work. And when you dig down deep, you discover it's not that it didn't work. You just didn't actually execute. And that's, you can't blame it on the idea if you didn't actually follow through.
Yeah, right. Yep. Okay, our last one for the day on our 5 dysfunctional habits of unhealthy church boards is that the church fails to establish clear lines of authority for these boards to begin with. Or maybe, sometimes we see this pretty frequently. What might be written in any official documents isn't how things actually play out in real life week to week. But yeah, a board has got to have the authority to lead. If they're going to be charged with making certain types of decisions in the church, they have to actually be given the authority to do that. And many times boards end up getting cut off at the knees because of other things: congregation, committees, staff, just various things, without having clear distinctions and levels of authority. From the congregation to boards to pastors to staff to committees to ministry leaders to volunteers, all this has to get baked into the cake properly in the right ratios, or you end up with something falling flat and not coming out of the oven at the end what you would have expected or what you would want to offer guests. Well, that was created this entire analogy of baking something, Scott, with a recipe. Right on the fly. How about that one?
Yeah, I think this is important. I mean, just even think about, take it out of the church context for a minute and just think about a business. If you've got a bunch of employees and they don't really know, what do I have the ability to just do? What do I need to get approval on? And what do I need to just do? What can I just do? When that's unclear, then that disincentivizes people from having any kind of initiative. If they assume there's going to be 18 layers of red tape between me and any decision, it's easier just not to make a decision. And the irony is, very often church boards feel the same sense of bureaucracy and red tape, that it's largely self-imposed. And so you have the same disincentives in place for them to make any kinds of decisions. They go, well, this is actually something that we'd have to run through this committee. You have upside down structures where the boards are not the ultimate authority, and so they would have to get approval through finance and through personnel and through the nominating committee and through they have to get things have to clear all of these lower level committees who have their own dysfunctions in place before they can make a decision that then maybe also then has to get signed off on by the congregation. It's so ridiculously bureaucratic, and it's all done in the name of, checks and balances and things like that, which are all good. But it's not sustainable. It's not healthy. Again, baked into the cake is the pace at which churches tend to work. So if the elders make a decision on something, but it needs to go through these 3 different committees, well, they only meet once a month, and then they are subject to the same delays on making a decision. So you're talking about, I mean, it's not uncommon, AJ, for us to encounter a church who takes 6, 9, 12 months to make a decision on something that really should have been able to have been decided within, a month to 3 month window. And it's just not good. So very often, though, this is because they don't have clear lines of authority in the first place. Is this something that I can just do? Can we just make this decision? Can we pull the trigger on this? And when there's any sort of ambiguity, the default will be to not make a decision. That will be the default. Oh, what if we do this wrong? What if we upset this group of people? And so then they just don't. And that creates dysfunction. So then this is why then, AJ, going back to the very beginning, we have boards that appear to be staying busy, but they don't get a lot done because they have all these bad habits. I'll just recap them. They spend time on trivial things. They have unclear board expectations. What is the job of a board member in the first place? They elevate low capacity leaders generally, especially as it relates to strategic thinking. They don't follow through on things, and they don't have clear lines of authority. So they don't even know in what areas they can just act and in what areas they need to delegate and trust and, have others execute. And so I really think these are some of the 5 most consistent dysfunctional habits we see pop up.
Yes, with far-reaching implications. So I hope this has been helpful today. As Scott said at the top of the show, we encourage you to, rewatch this or listen to this with your team, and talk about, maybe this needs to be on the agenda, to talk about ways that you can improve your board in the near future. This has been episode 157 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. So today's article is at malphursgroup.com/157. And there's easy ways for you to share it there with those on your team or others that you think would be helped by this topic. We are a nonprofit ministry, as we've been reminding you each week. And so having you partner with us financially to help make all of this possible, the development of all the resources that we do, because you here in the United States that are listening, your gifts to our ministry, and you're working with us whenever you engage with the Malphurs group and there are service fees, that money goes right back into our ministry to make all of this stuff available to pastors and leaders around the world at no cost. Outside the United States, we do a lot of work with churches, and you're helping making that possible. So we're thankful to you for that. We'll be back with you next week with another new topic. We'll see you then.